There was a thing we do, and I wasn't going to ask Ben because I don't know if he'd done it. Had a very busy week. He was a little late to work this morning. Holier Than Thou, where Ben goes through, and I think it's just people, Ben, who've treated Ben really badly.
It's just a chance for me to vent.
You can vent, you can vent. And I know you put up with a lot, ringing and trying to get interviews, and we were so optimistic, Dr. Rand Hazoo, that you'd be on the program, then you just cancel and you heard us. So it's Holier Than Thou. A lot of you like it, and it gets a few hits on the online.
Should we do the theme song? There we go. Or the theme
into it.
Intro.
It's yours, Ben.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, it's coming towards the end of the show on a Friday, which means for what it's worth that it's time for Holier Than Thou, the weekly segment where we let you know who's ignoring us this week, who's ducking and weaving their way out of answering your questions on stances they have or decisions they've made. Now, it's an interesting one this week because we don't actually have a government yet to be ignored by, but make no mistake, there's still plenty of lanyard-wearing bureaucrats and politicians who harbour more than enough contempt for the taxpayer between them to cover two governments, let alone one. So kicking off the list this week, we actually have Tory Whanau, and I must preface this by saying this is not just in relation to her repeatedly batting away our interview requests by way of her media staff. It looks as though the mainstream in New Zealand have picked up on her reluctance to front for media on any number of issues. News Hub's Ryan Bridge went on a Holier Than Thou-esque spiel this week about the Green Aligned Mayor's apathy toward ratepayers. Now, Tory Whanau recently directed her council not to remove a protest mural plastered in Wellington City that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. As the creative capital of Aotearoa, she opined, I do not agree with the approach to remove art from dedicated spaces that speaks to the hard, complex, and at times abhorrent issues of the day. Well, it wasn't art, it was an absolute eyesore. She goes on to say, art helps us digest unimaginable harm and things that we may struggle to comprehend. While that may be true, I think it's also worth noting that fronting for interviews and explaining your decisions as mayor also greatly helps people comprehend complex issues that they may struggle to understand otherwise, perhaps more so, I would venture to suggest, than choosing not to remove some graffiti from a wall. In any case, National's Chris Bishop pointed out the speed and decisiveness with which Wellington Council would likely have removed the mural if it was instead calling for the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas, something which Whanau has not, in traditional Greens fashion, been willing to discuss for any media outlet. In the interest of balance here, actually, though, I would just also point out the National Party clearly have not parted with their fondness under Luxon for lambasting their own MPs for expressing their personal views. They're reported to have had words with Bishop for an email he sent outlining his stance on the conflict. But there you have it. Tory Whanau, long-held apathy for the media and for explaining her decisions to Wellingtonians, rears its ugly head once again, and Whanau makes the list this week. Next up, and staying actually on the Israel-Palestine issue, we have Christchurch's Mayor Phil Major, who perplexingly seems to be under the impression that his job as chief bureaucrat for a city in the South Island of New Zealand gives him the mandate to fiddle about with international relations. Last weekend, the Christchurch mayor put his foot down and said enough is enough vis-a-vis turmoil in the Middle East. He penned a letter to the mayor of Hiroshima and president of the Mayors for Peace, Kazumi Matsui. Unfortunately, questions from us about what on earth he was up to and who on the international stage will give a flying monkeys what the mayor of Christchurch thinks about the conflict in Gaza will remain unanswered for the foreseeable, as his media team informed me he'd be busy attending a number of cup and show events today. Phil Major then quite literally off to the races, and now an honorary member of the Holier Than Thou Club. Lastly on the list this week, an honourable mention goes to the Islamic Federation of New Zealand for, in typical nuanced and subtle fashion, calling on the government to boot out the Israeli ambassador to New Zealand. This request puts them in the enlightened company of the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, famous, of course, for their diplomacy and capacity for observing nuance. As many of you know, the ambassador was on the show this week explaining the mood amongst the Jewish community. So, in the interests of balance, we got in touch with the Federation of Islamic Associations of New Zealand to explain why the Israeli ambassador should be expelled, but got nothing but radio silence in response. And I think I might add, as a late entrance this morning, Dr. Was it Razoo?
Rand Hazoo.
Dr. Rand Hazoo. Can I just say it is the worst form of apathy towards the topic for which you were invited to speak on, to agree to an interview and then cancel 15 minutes later because of some sort of half-assed research. So do better. That's it for this week. The Holier Than Thou list, 2 mayors and an Islamic Federation stirring the pot as regards New Zealand response to the conflict in Gaza, and then running for the hills when faced with the prospect of answering questions about it. We'll be back next week to remind you how unbecoming it is as a public representative not to answer the phone when the public rings.